We are back for another episode. Got an exciting topic today, constraint-led training, everyone's dream topic.
It's my dream topic, but
Yes. Laura and I will be diving into that soon. Before I get to that, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our listeners to help us keep making this. It's super helpful if you like it, review it, share your favorite episodes with people. We try to talk about topics that we get asked questions about or that are super relevant to like the current topics that we're seeing in softball. So if you find something helpful, share it, like it, review, go on to whatever you're listening to it on and do that for us. That would be great. It helps us be able to spend the time to put this content out, which we obviously want to keep doing. So if anyone could do that, that would be great. And now for the main event, constraint-led training.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yes, and start. So we obviously train differently at OGX and have for 5+ years. So say we didn't always train differently. And it really started for us from this like question of what is the best way for our athletes to improve? I would say that's also sometimes called skill acquisition. So what is the best way for us to see change? What I jokingly refer to often of my old hitting instructor self is that you would say something like, keep your hands up. And then the person would hit a line drive like 3 times later. And you would say like, just like that.
Magic.
Without any video review or reality of whether that was true, that what you had said happened. Our training at the time that I would say things like that was very just like front toss, like pretty lower intensity skill, not challenging the athletes in a lot of ways. And so then when they did bad in games, it was like, well, I told you to keep your hands up and you must not have. And so as we got access to more information, better video, I think that was probably the first thing we did. We got access to high-speed video, even clearer than what we were able to see up until that point. I remember when I was in college was the first time, RightView Pro. I was trying to, on Mike's episode, I was like, there's this video, and I couldn't remember the name, RightView Pro. It just came out, and it was the first time we all got to see any video like that of ourselves. But it was blurry and grainy, and you couldn't see everything. So we have access now to cameras where you could see clearly everything that's happening. And so just the idea that we got access to video, the idea that we got access to machine more often, higher intensity, that, all of these things started coming into the softball space. And we learned basically we are not doing what we say we're doing. Like we are saying this athlete is getting better because of X, but when you look at the video, that's not happening. And I think that for us at OGX, and me and Ashley really at the time, was our first we got to do better. And so either, we can go down the track of diving into biomechanics, which is either that doesn't need to happen, and so I think there was a question about we might be saying and doing and trying to guide the wrong things. And then also, if it does need to happen, and I think like lots of asterisks around what we mean by that, but if it does need to happen, what is the best way besides just like barking at our athletes, which doesn't seem to be working, for them to make the change? And so around this time that we were asking those questions, there were people in other sports that were really buying into this concept and research around constraint-led training, getting some clarity on the best ways to get skill acquisition in certain contexts, and along with all the other factors that go into skill acquisition, long-term development, there's other pieces, but this particular avenue of constraint-led training, and we really started diving into those concepts. And it looks different on pitching and hitting, but we have found that it's a much more effective way to see progress in our athletes. And so maybe first, from that sort of intro, Laura, if you want to give us like the Gen Pop definition of what is constraint-led training.
Yeah. Obviously this could be an entire series, months, years, books of a podcast, but I always describe constraint-led training specifically as like you're just trying to keep your athletes out of the gutter and let them explore. I use bowling as such an example because you think about that, the bumper concept. It's we roll the ball down the lane, right? Bowling, I think, is a great example of this. We roll the ball down the lane. It doesn't matter if it's a young kid's birthday party or, someone who's a professional bowler. The goal is the same, knock all the pins down, right? The goal itself does not change. But in order to meet the individual rolling the ball where they're at, we change things. We change things about maybe the way they roll the ball, the weight of the ball. We accommodate, right, for meeting that person where they're at. So we'll put, bumpers in the gutter essentially, so that the little kids can feel, the rush of knocking lots of pins down. Then we take those bumpers away the more professional the bowler is. The goal doesn't change though. It's still, in our world, it's still throw as hard as you can safely, swing as hard as you can safely, right? Hit the ball far, hit it hard. Those things don't change. But if we kind of take a step back and go, what are all the things about each individual athlete that they bring to the table? Constraint-led training is not, let me put all of these like safety measures in place so that you can't fail. That's actually the complete opposite of it. It's, let's just put some boundaries on the edges, right? Let's make sure that we are not getting too far in one direction or too far in another, and let you explore sort of like, this threshold in between, whether it's movement, whether it's a pitch type, whether it is a zone of their swing. It doesn't matter. They just need the freedom to explore that. And constraint-led training it is a newer concept. If you think back to like the roots of coaching, they're often really paired with teachers. And so I always explain, like, think of how we've been taught things in school. When something is complex, we break it down into pieces. And so it makes a lot of sense when coaches are, inherently teachers, and that's the way they've been taught to learn complex information, that we would break movement down that way. But the reality is the brain doesn't do that. It doesn't think that single input at a time. It's taking in so much information all the time. And then the idea of self-organization seems scary and loose, and the athlete has to explore. It's how they're going to figure out, within the context of their swing, their pitching patterns, the strength and conditioning exercises. It doesn't matter, as applicability to lots of things. How are they exploring that? But the coach's responsibility in constraint-led training is not to step back and do nothing. It is not to step back and never give a cue, never say anything, never have a conversation. But it relies on sort of the setup of an experiment of the environment for that athlete. How can I help you to explore, stay out of the gutter, but explore lots of ways to solve this movement problem, whatever it might be? And so constraint-led training is not like willy-nilly do all the things that, the complete opposite of what breaking things down and very verbal-based cues are. It is, we're just going to put some guardrails on for right now. And those guardrails are going to be about where you are maturationally, where you are developmentally, where you are. I mean, for our athletes, where are you in your cycle? Where are you? I mean, there's lots of things that will throw any human being off. And so in the sport environment, in the movement environment, we got to respect those things. And so constraint-led training is just keep them out of the gutter. Just keep them out of the gutter. Don't be too prescriptive where you are trying to just puppeteer their movements, and don't be so hands off that they don't have any guidance or structure. You're trying to give them some structure, let them explore and measure. I think that's one of our biggest challenges internally for us, is that our training has absolutely adopted this concept. I mean, I think it's a very difficult concept for new coaches that join us to sort of latch onto initially, because it's unsettling. It can feel like it takes the coach's power away from them, and that's difficult. Right? That's difficult to perceive. What do I say? What do I do if I just am letting them go? If I'm letting them just throw the ball down the lane, what the heck do I do? And really on the other side of it, and I hope that our coaches would say this, it's very empowering. You get to see like, hey, I may not have the answer for this athlete, but I got some ideas. Let's try it. It begins an open dialogue. And so we've got to get away from just that rigidity, but we also have to give them structure. And so that's the balance. And I can say that, and that sounds super easy, but I know what goes into our programming. I know the thoughtfulness that goes into it. Just the way we factor in environments, but we struggle with this internally. Our training is there, But now we're on the other side of it where we got to send the information back to the athlete, to the parent, to the client, discussing those environments, discussing how, okay, your work on the tee, your work on front toss, your work on machine on, top spin only. How are these things translating? And I think that's something you have said that I always come back to is like, girls don't get better with puberty. And so just naturally, they're going to do this. So another word for this concept is nonlinear pedagogy. It's not expecting this like straight line of bad to good. It's all these ups and downs, and that your general trend is going this way. But young female athletes, especially because of their menstrual cycle, have stuff that just every single day, every single week, every single cycle. And so the constraint-led approach is like, let's just meet you where you're at, right? Let's not give you things too prescriptive. Let's meet you where you're at. You're still exploring the same stuff. And we've got to build your tolerance for failure. I love that. We talked about that yesterday in our team meeting of like, what is an athlete's tolerance for failure? And I think constraint-led training really helps them to explore that in addition to the physical aspect of it. How do I handle failure? How do I build resiliency against, man, that was not a good session for me? How do I come back from that? It's not, let me just control you more. It's, okay, let's change a couple things. Let's try some things. How do you feel about that? Did that get better? So it sounds super easy when I say it as the non-coach person, but I think being on the other side of it, I see how much empowerment there is for our coaches to really, one, know their athletes, right? It's a level of individualization. It's not, I'm going to change every exercise in their program. It's knowing that when that athlete shows up on that day and she's had a hard test, hard exam, rough day, she's not here with you, right? And so how can I accommodate and meet her where she's at? That's a simplistic version of constraint-led training on a daily basis. The longer version of periodization, it has to be more thoughtful because we need that information to keep molding that athlete, knowing she's going to go up and down. And that's the tricky part. And that's scary. It's not easy.
Yeah. I think it's complicated. This kind of goes to we were talking yesterday about data driven versus data informed. And actually today I was listening on a podcast where he said, it's not data driven, it's data inspired.
Inspired. And I was like, oh, I know. Right.
Yeah. I was like, but he was separating like there is data driven, but this is data inspired. Anyways, I was like, okay, we're starting to get into some nuance here, but I think this concept of constraint-led training is super complicated, and maybe we use the phrase to like, we do constraint-led training. It's like everyone does constraint-led training. Like there is an element that in many ways, what I am describing as how I coached, back in what feels like 1972, but whatever, it was not that long ago.
Then, but that's okay.
Yeah. Was constraint-led training, I guess you could argue. But the only environment I was sort of controlling, the only bumpers I was putting on was my cueing.
Your external cueing.
And so I was saying, lift your hands, do this, do that. That is constraint-led training. That's like there is an element that is pieces of it. Yeah. So there can be some cueing. So I think even more specifically for us is that they're inside of this understanding of what are all the environments that go into like the athlete as the center. And there are a lot of constraints, things that feed her. There is in a game, the umpire's zone, the roar of the crowd, the dirt she's standing on, the shoes she's wearing. There is all of these things. There is the pitcher she's facing, the pitcher's motion, the break of the ball. There is, there's the sky, like, there's so many things that come in. And the manipulation in training of which of those has the biggest impact on an athlete is really the questions that we have asked. And what we have found through, I think at this point, years of testing, retesting, iteration, like what works is we do still externally cue somewhat. And it kind of depends, and we can get into a little bit on the athlete but the environment and sort of putting constraints on the environment, which we can talk about examples of that, giving constraints around the feedback, which you as referenced. So we can talk about that. And then giving, so like feedback can mean a couple things. I guess feedback can mean that they see video, that they see sort of the skill themselves, and then they're allowed to sort of process and do that in ways. It could mean what actually happens as a result of what they did. And so these sort of like inputs that don't come from me saying things, and on a kind of similar, although it's, in many ways opposite, don't come from me forcing some certain position or specific things. That this process from, okay, generally we understand, we want to accomplish XYZ because that's what the skill, is asking us to do to be more efficient in whatever ways we need to do. And so here are the general things that we know we can give as constraints to get this athlete closer to that. And that's really what we have done through that. So I think this concept of like nonlinear, the nonlinear skill acquisition, and also specifically constraint-led training that is more environment and about like the inputs we're giving the athlete and the feedback we're giving the athlete is really what we do at OGX. It's our version of that. And I think sometimes constraint-led training can be confusing because one, it says constraints, and so there's an element
Yes,
of like,
right.
what does, like, well, I'm really doing constraint-led training because I'm absolutely constraining what she can do, and breaking it down to the most. And also that when you read about it, I think of the presentations you've given, it's just like, well, how the hell am I supposed to control the crowd? There's just so many inputs. And so it's like, in this environment, this training environment, I am the sort of environment creator. And so how am I going to get that athlete to accomplish, get closer to the thing that I want to accomplish? So what we talked about for failure yesterday, so I'll talk about hitting a little bit, and then we can both kind of talk on pitching a little bit. But from hitting standpoint, what we are trying to do with our hitters, and it's tough for a variety of reasons. It's hard sometimes to get the right environment because if, for some of our remote athletes, maybe they only have access to tee and front toss, or they don't have access to as many high intensity things or different training bats, which we're trying to put, more out there, different, having tossers available. So that makes it hitting, I think, sometimes more difficult just because you're kind of asking to create environments that maybe aren't always as easy to recreate when you're not in our actual facility, but it can be done. There's lots of ways to work around it, and we have lots of remote athletes that have found a lot of good solutions. But what we are trying to create is, what is the absolute most failure that we could put on this athlete for her to start having to figure it out?
To expose her.
Yes. And so what we have done and developed over the past several years is, when we see this, it's not efficient. And I think where the space is in a little bit is that then it's like, okay, well, we make them all look a certain way. Incorrect. If you watch our training space, that's definitely not what happens. And I always say to athletes, like, it does happen sometimes, but this idea that you're going to see like a before video where you looked one way and an after video where you looked literally like a different human being, that doesn't happen. You're still going to have some of your nuances of how your body moves and things like that. And when you are struggling, you're almost certainly going to go back to the way your body has always sort of corrected itself. But the skill requires things.
Yes.
And so knowing that the skill requires things and what we're trying to get out of that from that standpoint. And so if, for instance, we are trying to make a hitter more adjustable, she has a posture that doesn't allow her adjustability on an up pitch. She has early side bends. And you don't really necessarily need to know all of these terminologies. And it's not the point of it. But I want to fix her posture in a way that she learns it on her own. Mm-hmm. And when I say learns it on her own, I mean her body figures it out. It can be fast sometimes, but her body figures out what it needs to do to not have that posture anymore. It is unlikely. It's not impossible if it's like an intense thing or, something. It's not impossible that I could just say like, hey, stand taller. Right. It is a small percentage that we can accomplish something like that, and it stick because the athlete like felt herself get into that and really understood and figured out with the body how to do that and then replicate it over and over. So if I'm trying to fix posture in a hitter, I basically want to make as much of the training environment be bad mishits unless she makes a change. Unless she makes a change. Now, there are a bunch of things that go into that. The age of the athlete, you know, so this is, you said we talked about this yesterday, and what I was saying is like, you're not going to have a 12-year-old come in and just like crush her soul and just make her fail over and over.
Want her to come back, basically. She'll never come back.
One, because she won't make that type of body adjustment. That's just not possible probably for her where she is developmentally. So we need to, the sort of like feedback needs to be a little softer and allow her to, you know, we might just give her some different start types. She'll probably have more T work. She'll have more low intensity work. We'll sort of put some minimal guidance on her while she's developing developmentally, getting stronger on the strength floor. And that combination will be fine. And then we will have moments where it's like, okay, now we're going to make it tough and we're going to test that a little bit. But all the way to the extreme of our highest level college athletes where it's like, here's the thing, you know, it doesn't mean you're never going to have these like, hey, let's just feel good for a while. But we are going, your training part of that is like, let's fail 100% of the time. Not actually, because you're going to figure it out within that session. But that's my goal as the coach is like, you will not have a successful rep in that posture. That's the goal. And so the way we accomplish that is with different angles, with different bats, you know, with different spins on the machine, different ways that we can expose that. If she struggles with up, then she might do backspin on the machine. They're not going to go crazy. Maybe the velo is a little lower. So like, it's not like you're going to swing and miss literally. You know, if she has side bend, she might do short bat. If she wraps, she might do a long bat. Like basically it's just going to make it more likely that she's not going to have success in that. That's how we create training. And so what you said of like, it's unsettling for coaches sometimes when they come into our space or parents to be like, you know, I put a joke because Kay posted about this and I was like, what about mechanics? Because it just looks, there's part of it that looks very hands off. Like, what are you even doing in here? You know? And it does require some more work in some ways on the coaches to make sure the athlete knows why she's doing the things she's doing. Like if she goes through 10 reps and fails and never makes any adjustment, it was just like, well, I just did this drill 10 times. And like, what was the point of that? That's not helpful either. And so there's this back and forth from a, like, what's our intent? What did you feel there? That's why video feedback sometimes, depending on the athlete, is good for this. Like giving this loop of feedback to be as short and fast as possible. So it's basically like long-term, it's assessment, program, retest over and over. But then also in every training session, there's like little bitty babies of that. As much as possible.
The key that you said that I think like is so important to point out is that the feedback, it's internal to the athlete. It is not you as the coach with your, you know, external expectations of what a good swing should look like or your own biases of, you know, we see this a lot where we will, you know, assess a pitching staff typically at a college. And it's very clear that the coach's movement bias, like their eye, is influencing who they recruit. Everybody has the same movement challenges. They all have the same maybe build or however generically you want to say that. I think the single most important thing though that you bring up is that the change of bat lengths, of weights, of even just keeping the bat the same, but changing whether it's a plyo ball because good contact is an instant feedback for those types of things. Is that the feedback is not you saying that was a good rep. It's instant. Either she feels that she struggles with it. The outcome is not great. She mishits. The contact on the ball is not great. And then you're exploring, okay, you tell me what you felt on that. It's not me telling you as the coach what to feel. I want to hear from you. Hey, I designed this environment thinking like, this is really going to challenge you. And what I think, you know, the root of it is like, can she tolerate in her current stage, whatever that might be, on a daily basis, monthly basis, long-term in her development, can she tolerate that failure? And that goes, as you said, beyond just in the moment. But I think our movement assessment drove so much of our understanding of like, boy, we are asking our athletes to do lots of things, especially young athletes, to do lots of things that they physically under these high intensity environments, they can't accomplish. So what are we asking them to do? And I think our movement assessment is just such a great example of a coach driven, hey, I'm seeing this in the cage, I'm seeing this in her motion, and I don't see where it's coming from, and I missed it. I don't understand she can't do this. All right, we've got to revise our movement assessment. It's not giving us the information. And I love this sort of, pairing of this very short term in the moment feedback, but then our systems have been built on this longer term. What is your trajectory, right? Movement quality, I'll use it as an example. It's not always going to be perfect. You're a human. You have fatigue, you have stress, you have anxiety. We just want to see what are your general trends in terms of how fatigue, affects you. How does weather affect you? We just need to keep talking about those things. But it's instantaneous feedback that's internal, that she gets to process because she gets to feel it. We talk about athlete feel. Athletes can't have feel unless they are allowed to fail. That is what feeling something feels like, is that they've done it and they've done it wrong and their body goes, that doesn't work, because there is some outcome attached to it that they can instantly perceive. And so it's where there's always a place for external cues. There's always a place for communication and, connection as a coach and an athlete, but the feel can't be externally driven. The athlete literally has to be given a chance to feel that. And she can't if every move she makes, she's getting this feedback of like, you did it wrong. She's like, I don't know that I did it wrong. I can't feel that, right? You haven't let me do it wrong.
Well, it's like saying, okay, here's 252 plus 172. Here's the answer.
Right.
Like, did you, like, now learn it. Right. It's just like, that doesn't work. Now it's different. It's the body. It's much more complex than even that. But like, it just doesn't work. It might happen. Maybe. Like a lot of asterisks, probably not in the actual way, but maybe it will happen. Maybe they can hear you and make some sort of change, but their ability to tap into that as it starts to fade away, to start getting feedback that it's no longer there, and to know like, whoa, like I know when this happens, I need to tap into X. Mm-hmm. You've erased all of that. So absolutely. Even if you get the successful result you want, you've erased all the learning that actually makes them acquire the skill that in a way that sticks. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish. And I think when we're saying like, what's the failure you can tolerate? Of course, there's the mental aspect, and that's real of like, what can someone tolerate from a failure standpoint? But really also what that means is kind of what you were saying, which is like, can that person make that change? So it's like, okay, I could make people change. I could make people fail constantly, so let me put this angle with this bat, with this kid, and she's never going to touch the ball. And is that what we're going for? There's this balance of like, and the reason she's never going to be able to touch the ball is because she can't even hinge. So like we're 4,000 light years away from her actually tapping into the adjustment we want. And so, as I was saying, when we're on that side of the spectrum, we're going to still be putting them in an environment. It's not like don't swing until you get there, but we're going to put them in less sort of forced, failure environments, but we'll still have moments of it, because as she parallels that with lifting, she'll all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're moving, like how much more can we push the line? And we're trying to hold that. So there's elements of like, can that athlete make the adjustment you're asking them to make? And that's really when we're talking about what failure they can tolerate, why we do assessments, why we understand what an athlete brings in, why we sometimes are like, this athlete should be able to do this and isn't, based on at least the information I have, and or like, she looks so weird today, that we often intuitively know to say, are you on your period today?
Right.
Did you have a test today or something? And they're like, oh yeah, I joked, but like the day after break, I was like, this is a train wreck. Everyone like slept until 2 p.m. and like, it was just a disaster, because things that normally maybe they could tolerate and do in training, they couldn't do because of other things that we are not in control of, other constraints that they had on themselves. And so it's kind of knowing and trying to assess, and we're talking about younger athletes in the most part. So it's like, we're not going to have access to every ounce of everything. So we're not always going to know exactly, but trying to really understand as much as possible the answer to, can they do this, and can they tolerate this, and will they be able to make the change we're asking them to make?
Yeah. When you first thought that came to my mind was, a question I would put back on any coach listener or parent listener who works with, their athlete is like, does she have feel the way you think she has feel, or is she just really good at replicating what she thinks you want, right? You have to separate those two things. Lots of athletes get really good with just being a robot and just over and over again. They figure out essentially how to meet your constraints, meaning you want them to look a certain way.
Correct.
You have some external expectation of you have to do it this way. Oftentimes, those expectations, they are built from elite athletes. And I think we hear this phrase a lot, but it bears repeating. Elite athletes are elite compensators. They are those elite athletes because, one, they work their butt off and they know themselves, and they just have either innate natural talent. They can thank their parents for genetics, lots of things. But it is very real that the better you get at movement, the more solutions you have and the more ways in which you will find to compensate and still be successful. And so we have to be very careful about saying, all right, if you want to, and I use Monica Abbott as the example. She's just an example, but lots of young girls say, I want to throw like X pitcher. I want to throw like Monica Abbott. I want to throw as hard as her. I want my mechanics to look like her. And my immediate response is, then you need to move like her. You need to train like her.
Right.
You need to put the same.
Maybe her height, her weight.
You got to be everything. You have to have her body morphology. Like, there are a lot of things. Now, it does not mean that example of a pitcher doesn't do things that are great or that she's not great. There is no magic. Everybody's got to do it the same way. So as you're thinking about like, okay, what cues am I giving to my athletes, or if you're a parent working with your kid, am I giving her a string to puppeteer her, or am I actually just giving her some space to explore this? And like, I got to shut my mouth, and I have to deal with that as the coach. I have to be comfortable with their failure. And I think it's a two-way street. The athlete has to be comfortable with, okay, this is my tolerance today for failure. I can be in this headspace. And the younger they are, the harder that is, right? And the more that something underneath like a strength and conditioning program is going to help them versus these very detailed hitting environments, for example. And then from the coach/parent side, it's like, I got to be comfortable in that silence and letting her figure it out. And so it is very much a two-way, it's not the coach just sits back and does nothing. They have to wrestle with, man, I really want to say something, but is that going to help or hurt her? Is she going to hear that and go, I did it wrong? It's not wrong. It was an ineffective solution, right? And so there's lots of solutions, and that particular solution just didn't work this time. That's okay. We got to keep exploring. And like, it sounds all like happy and fluffy, but it has sincere impact on their ability to develop movement solutions that are resilient to fatigue, resilient to injury, resilient to all of the environmental things that we don't control. I joke about, our training spaces. It's a gym, right? Of course, music's always blaring, and I love it because there's an intentional focus that's required, because that's crowd noise. And how are you replicating for your athletes what they're going to experience, all the inputs they'll experience from a game setting? And it's not easy. I do not sit here and pretend that is an easy thing to do, but it is two-way. Can you get the athlete to tolerate failure, to tolerate change? I think of like pitching in my mind is a little different from a failure standpoint, but we've had experience with pitchers where their patterns are so locked that a 7-ounce plyo, just the feedback of the sand, not even a change of weight. We change nothing else about them, just the 7-ounce plyo. They're like, nope, can't do it. Nope, too hard. Because they have one solution. And so they have been pigeonholed really into this one solution, and they've got no way to get out of it. So fatigue shows up, the dirt in front of the pitching rubber ain't great. The coach or the umpire strike zone has shrunk to the size of a pea. What are you going to do? How are you going to adapt? And I think constraint-led training is really, it's like you're creating their ability to adapt and be flexible. And that means as a coach, you've got to zip it for a second and be thoughtful about how you're putting them in those environments.
Yeah. And we create somewhat of the same concept in pitching. The difference is pitching doesn't have a variable acting on you in the same way. And so the adjustability to get to efficient solutions while your environment is literally constantly changing is something very specific to hitting. And in pitching, the way we create this is like by exploring, getting out of rigidity or things like that, through the ball changing, right? And the way you create failure in that is that if the plyo weight is changing and you're trying to throw it to the same target,
Exactly.
you know, you're going to have some failure in that. You're going to have to create some different solutions to be able to accomplish the task. So it's very similar. It's just not quite as dramatic or in your face because the skills are different. You know, you're in control in many ways. And there are things that change, as you've referenced, the ground and the zone and the hitter. And those are things we work through and try to create things like that. But you are trying to create a sort of you know, you are in control much more in pitching. And so the concepts and the way you accomplish it are different. And the way that we accomplish it and that is different, but it's very similar in knowing where is this athlete meeting us? What is she capable of changing? And then what are the constraints I can put on her that will start to push her towards that change, you know? And I think it's really understanding that. I was thinking of a hitter that we talked about today, just via our messaging platform. She's young and not super strong. She's a middle schooler. She shouldn't be really strong. It's not like this is a weak athlete. It's just like she's a middle schooler. And we were talking through kind of some body positioning she's getting into with like her head and like why she would be doing that and how to get her out of it. And it's just really interesting because to me, it's so clear. It's a young hitter who can't hinge, right, who has no posterior strength yet, like came in just as a young, not strong athlete yet, sort of like developmentally appropriate, but just not there. And has been told even by us probably like you need to hinge, you need to get your butt back, you need to get in this position. And the way her body was able to do what we were telling her to do was to bend her head and create this. And so she's like, I am in that position. And so through sort of just cueing externally in the body, we've you know, whether it was through a combination of our doing and our cueing and or what the sort of system cued her and brought her into, have created a posture where we're like, well, that's not what we're going for.
Right. Task failed successfully.
Yes. And so, you know, there's an element of like, okay, when an athlete can't move in that way, what are the environments that we should be creating and what should we be asking them to do? And again, it's not that we don't hit, but it's just understanding that like probably they're not going to do that. And so if you're standing there and saying like, Sally, hinge, and then Sally can't even hinge under low intensity, and then she hits a line drive and you're like, great, just like that. Sally didn't hinge. Sally got into some body position that looked better to your eye or just happened to get a good result doing exactly what she's always done. And now you've given her feedback that was positive.
Yep.
And so now Sally's going to try to do that again. And that probably wasn't what we wanted to do. And so when we're talking about having, you know, we say often we see athletes who are so rigid that come to us. And there's a variety of reasons. It is sports specialization. It is the way we have trained is one way. In pitching, it's on the rubber, full intensity, or super broken down and not in a way that relates to pitching at all. It's those two extremes. And in hitting, it is front toss with a coach cueing you.
Yep.
Like there are two things we have done. And what that has created is athletes who, when we say rigid, what we mean is like they can't get out of the one thing that they are doing right now. They can't vary in the way you said. I put a plyo in their hand and it's like goes over the wall. I say, hey, go at 50% here for pitching. And they fly and throw it max intensity because they don't know how to bring the intensity down. I toss angle in and they get jammed over and over and over and cannot tap into anything different. These are the examples we see all the time by the training we've kind of led with traditionally. And so what we have tried to create is, and it's hard because it doesn't always feel great for the athletes. It looks, as you said, like there's so much thought that goes into all the programs. It's hard sometimes to convey that because sometimes it looks a little more hands off because we're not always like right in the athlete's face, kind of cueing them and saying things. So it's a tough space to get across to people, but it works when athletes get it. When they are in there, they aren't rigid anymore. They're working out of rigidity. When they're listening to the feedback and they can listen to, oh, that ball went high. You know, I pitched that plyo. I picked up a lighter plyo and I threw it up. Okay. You know, I'm going to think about it. And again, this is not that someone's telling them, but in their brain, they're like, get rid of it sooner. And they do, and it hits the spot. And now they've tapped into some variability. When hitters do the same thing, like I got jammed, I'm going to do X and now I barreled it up. when that is matched with us watching the progress to make sure it's having the performance goals that we want, like that's the magic sauce in our opinion. And that's when we see athletes have success that sticks and that they understand, versus the athletes who maybe they were in that training space, but they didn't get it. They didn't, they didn't ask to understand it. They didn't sort of like know what they were going for, and or they weren't in that environment at all, and they just have been spoon-fed external cues or whatever. That they get in spaces, and you're 2 months into season, and I look at a video of a hitter, I'm like, did you know you looked like this? Like, right. you have totally imploded, and you didn't even know it. Like, you didn't even know that was happening.
And
because
sometimes it won't show. Sometimes that won't show up until pain shows up too. That's the tricky part.
Right. For pitching, for sure, because you've lost efficiency, and for hitting, it's like you kind of like bought some success. You didn't really realize you were starting to get more to the oppo field. You didn't really realize your exit velo was ticking down, or whatever. Like, things were slowly starting to happen. And all of a sudden you're like, I can't clear a ball to save my life. I'm like, I bet you can't. Look at this video, and they haven't realized it because they didn't, like, one, the game is not always going to give you that feedback. So it's like in between games, they're not giving fed what's going on. They're not giving that loop of those things enough. And when that also is on top of, they never knew it in the first place. They never learned it in the first place. They never explored it in the first place. Like, that's so hard to get out of. It's like, we had a lot of college athletes that kind of came back for break, and they looked like that, which I think I kind of got into a little bit last week, or and that's frustrating. I think there's some frustration with that, but for most of the athletes who have trained with us a lot, that came back in 3 weeks, they could fix that. They just needed to be in the right environment with that space, but they understood what they were going for. They know how to tap into that. They're not rigid. But those are that's the space. So that's what training looks like with us. That's how we adopt constraint-led training. And I don't know that was super succinct. I also don't think we talked about pitching enough. So I think maybe next week when Ashley's on, probably just talking about plyos generally would be a great topic for next week. Because we do other things for pitching, pitch design and using high-speed camera and hand positioning. There's other feedback loops that we use, but plyos is obviously the biggest part of it. And so I think that would be a good follow-up next week.
And I think, what holds true across both, and I think obviously, selfishly, the pitching conversation is what I'm rooted in, but I see the bigger picture of how both skills, they come under this umbrella. Is like, where is she getting her positive reinforcement of what's good, right? If it is coming from coach and parent only, and it's coming from, I swing and my dad or my mom or my coach or my pitching instructor or my hitting instructor says, thumbs up. You're like, okay, great. Awesome. And she never has to then look internally to, was that good? Did I do that well? Did that feel good? She has no concept. Right. And so what where it shows up for us in the mismatch is oftentimes we will see athletes whose movement quality looks fantastic. Their power is great. And then they get into the swing or they get into their pitching patterns, and we're like, what the hell? Where is this power? Where is all of this stuff underneath that she cannot express? And oftentimes it's because the rigidity of her instruction has left her had no clue of what feels good. She has no idea that we'll have pitchers and hitters. They swing, and the first thing they do is, they look for something.
That good?
Was that good?
Was I late?
Yes.
That's my favorite question. Was I late? Was I on top or under it? I'm like,
or a young pitcher in assessment.
Idea. You popped the ball straight up. Like,
this happens to me all the time in assessments. I run a lot of our pitching assessments, and a young pitcher, maybe whatever, 8th grade freshman, doesn't matter. It's happened at every level. Launches a ball, right? It is so far off the target, or it's thrown behind her, and we just laugh about it. It's like, all right, I have watched a SEC commit launch a ball almost over our backstop. It happens. And it's like the first thing they do when I first meet them in an assessment, one is they look, if their parent's not there, they look at me like, oh shit. I'm like, I don't care. Do it again. Doesn't matter. You know what I mean? It's just a data point we don't collect, But when all of their external, is this good? Everything is coming externally, and their positive reinforcement of good or bad is like somebody else telling them that, they're going to get stuck. And so that's where those really prescriptive swing mechanics, pitch mechanics, It does really good athletes and really fundamentally solid athletes, genetically gifted. It does them such a disservice because then they can't express what they need.
Right. And I think it's also who cares? Like we've had times where we're like, that looked better. How'd that feel? And athlete's like, good. And maybe she said good because we said it looked better.
Totally.
And then we look at the result and we're like,
yep,
never mind.
Whoops.
That was bad.
Right.
So it's just like, okay, it's just like why like hold for a second, because it doesn't really, like, if you think that change is going to lead to X, I'm like, if you don't have that posture, you're going to be able to hit the up pitch better. And then they don't. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? So it's like we have done so many iterations of that. That's what I'm saying, is what we measure all the time is when we influence this, what result happens? Does that feed ultimately to the goal we're having? And we feel pretty confident. It doesn't mean that something doesn't come up. Things come up all the time where we're like, oh, that, that was unexpected. And we find a new sort of variable that maybe we didn't think about. But we've done that so much that we have a general idea. And so it allows us, when it doesn't work, to not be like, well,
right,
she's just not coachable. It's just more of like, oh,
coachable.
This is interesting. This is interesting because this really should work based on the information I have in front of me. And so let me go dig. What information don't I have? And that's where,
or it shouldn't,
right, or it shouldn't. And then it's all crazy that we're even trying to make it right. So that's the idea of it. I love it. I think it's fun, like puzzle. It's been a fun puzzle. And I like when it doesn't work too, because it's like, well, what are we doing here? What's our game plan?
Every new athlete just, I think, gives us an opportunity to just, not just test our systems. We've had enough athletes and enough assessments at this point where, we can bucket athletes, and there is definitely an appropriate nature for bucketing, at least an initial training program. There's lots of, I think, validity around that, of bucketing, initial training programs. What we want to stay away from, though, is bucketing them before the training program, right? So our movement quality is just our movement quality. We used to have a leveling system. We're like, okay, this is a level 1, this is a level 2. And we're like, that means nothing. It means nothing. It's garbage. It's an external label. There's maybe some things she does really well in her movement quality and some things she doesn't do well. She's great in the sagittal plane because she does a lot of Olympic lifting. She's a terrible rotator. So we have more generic, I'll say, like labels, but we are not categorizing or saying, well, in your movement quality and power and all these things outside of the things that matter in your swing and in your pitching patterns, you're this. And so you have to be this. No. We've got to take that step back and say, no, we got to see who they are. And then, because of our experience in attaching those things to training, we see how it manifests, right? We see, okay, this athlete, when she couldn't hinge and she was a middle schooler, here are the things that worked well for her. Let me use that as a starting place for the next athlete. Oh, that didn't work well for her. It is a constant experiment. And that's what that should be. It's thoughtful.
Yeah.
It's thoughtful and planned.
Yeah. I'm going to end on one thing. I think it's important with all of this that, just to make it clear, that we don't start with, this is what the athlete is bringing to the table now. And so then
she can never bring anything else to the table.
Then she can never do that. I think that it's both things. So if I'm thinking of like the funnel, there is the reality and the reason we measure the skill is there is a reality for things that are required in the skill to scale at the level you want. A certain bat speed, a certain posture to be able to get to certain pitches, a certain arm positioning to be able to deliver different spin types. Like there is the reality, and there are things. It doesn't mean if I put 10 pitchers on top of each other, they're going to look the same. They're going to look wildly different. But if they are accomplishing backspin, there's going to be something those pitchers are all doing the same. That's right. And if they are hitting the ball 85, there is going to be something those hitters are all doing the same, whether that's underlying power. There's things that we know that go into that. And so I think you have to know what you're ultimately striving to get that hitter to. And then also understanding you're not going to get there with this like cookie cutter approach. Everyone's going to get there different, but there are some absolutes that need to happen for you to continue to scale. And that's where, without knowing that or without starting from the right place there, designing an environment is a little bit nonsensical. And so you have to kind of know both. It's like, where is the athlete coming into this? And then what am I ultimately striving for her to have success at the level we're trying to go to? What are the things I'm trying to influence? And that is how we really do training. So I think understanding both of those is really important. So let's stop, because we could go on about this forever. As you said, we could do a skill acquisition thing, but I think it would be good next week, since we only touched on pitching a little bit. And Ashley, when she's back with us next week, to touch on really, I think we could obviously do a whole episode on plyos. And I think that would be a good one to kind of talk through how we use that, the things we manipulate, and how that looks. So until next week, review, like, share this with someone, anyone interested about constraint-led training.
Tell a friend about constraint-led training.
Tell a friend. Yes, that'd be fun. That was our job. All right, until next week.